Ukraine today is being invaded by Russia, and despite the astounding bravery of the Ukrainians, it is unlikely that they will last long against Russia. U.S. officials are warning that heavily armed Russian troops are inching ever closer to the Ukrainian capital of Kyiv. Ukraine's defiant president, Volodymyr Zelensky, appealed to his Western allies to do more than impose sanctions, to force Russia to get its troops out of Ukraine. There are big differences between the two forces. Russia has a much more capable air domain, its air defenses are stronger. There is a huge difference on helicopters and planes, available at every level, from transport aircraft, to fighter aircraft, to attack helicopters, reported by CNN. Just a look at the amount of money the two nations spend on defense gives an indication of the gap between the two. Ukraine spent $4.7 billion in 2021, just over a tenth of nuclear-armed Russia's $45.8 billion, according to the Military Balance Report by the International Institute for Strategic Studies, IISS, published last week. While the Russian government launched a drive, in 2008, to modernize its military, after a brief war with Georgia, Ukraine's weapons are still largely from the Soviet era. In its ambitions to join NATO, however, Ukraine has reorganized the structure of its armed forces. Where Russia has 900,000 active personnel in its armed forces, and 2 million in reserve, Ukraine has just 196,000, and 900,000 reservists. To fight the war, Ukraine on Wednesday began conscripting reservists, aged 18 to 60, according to IISS. In land forces alone, Russia has a twofold advantage, with 280,000 troops to Ukraine's 125,600. And its air force is nearly 5 times as strong, with 165,000 to Ukraine's 35,000. But, in terms of how many troops are in this particular operation, Johann Michel, a research analyst, who worked on the IISS report, said, Russia had an estimated 200,000 personnel, in and around Ukraine. That's including around 60 battle groups. The situation is evolving rapidly, and that number could change, but it's very large, and that's important. It's one of the largest in Eastern Europe that we've seen in years. Ukrainian numbers are more difficult, because everything they have is now mobilized, and they have called in reservists. There is a lot to compare here: attack aircraft, armored vehicles, surface-to-air missiles, but in general, Russia simply has more of everything. Russia has more than 15,857 armored fighting vehicles, to Ukraine's 3,309. It has more than 10 times the aircraft, 1,391 to Ukraine's 128, and 821 helicopters, to Ukraine's 55, if you include Navy aircraft. And where Russia has 49 submarines, Ukraine has none, according to IISS. As a nation that conducted over 700 nuclear weapons tests, Russia is considered the second most important in nuclear weapons development. Like the United States, Russia now has 6,490 warheads, which is hardly more than the United States. Similarly, there are 1,600 deployed warheads, compared to 1,600 in the American case. In reality, the world's largest bomb is the Russian-made giant bomb. The blast yield was 50 megatons of TNT, known as Tsar bomb. Although Ukraine does not possess nuclear weapons today, it did have approximately 5,000 nuclear weapons back in the day. Ukraine was once the third largest nuclear power in the world. Yes, just after its independence, in the early 1990s, Ukraine possessed a 5,000-plus nuclear arsenal inventory, along with the long-range missiles needed to fire them. By strength, this nuclear stockpile was the strongest, just after Russia and the US. The Ukrainian nukes were actually Soviet nukes that were in Ukraine, which remained in Ukraine after the USSR collapsed. Although the weapons were in Ukraine, they could only be operated using codes in Russia at the time. But even having physical possession of that many nuclear weapons is a big deal. But why did Ukraine give those up? The answer is that Back in the 1990s, there was no threat to Ukraine from a nuclear-armed adversary. Russia was weak, having just broken up from the Soviet Union, and Ukraine, having just gained independence, was looking for legitimacy from NATO and powers like the US. It wanted to prove itself to be a responsible member of the international community. So, Ukraine gave its nukes up to Russia in 1994, in a treaty called the Budapest Memorandum, in exchange for a guarantee that Russia, the US, and the UK would never use force or threats of force against Ukraine. They made a deadly mistake, as Russian tanks are marching into the Ukrainian capital. If Ukraine still had those nukes, the story today would have been completely different, as they would have stopped as a powerful deterrent. As a former Ukrainian defense minister said, "We gave away the nuclear capability for nothing." As Russia seems to be on the verge of taking over Ukraine, these words couldn't be more true. What are your opinion on the crisis? Let us know in comments. If you found this video helpful, do hit a like and subscribe our channel. Do hit the bell icon to stay tuned for further updates.